time over the recent weeks about the priests, and we're going to transition out of the book of Leviticus and move into the book of Numbers, because the book of Numbers goes back to being this combination text of having priestly traditions and J traditions and E traditions. And I want to look at a few key narratives in the book of Numbers that will look at the way that this book was put together, because there are some specific goals in mind of the redactor in terms of being able to maintain the priestly authority, and at the same time we have some of this earlier traditional material which seems to be a bit out of place. And so I want to be able to look at some of those with you, and some of them are actually some famous texts. And so what I want to do is I want to start with a... Hi, Leah. How are you? So I actually want to start with some texts that are more familiar to you. Hello there, Victor. How are you? All right. So the opening of the book of Numbers involves what? What is the crux of the opening of the book of Numbers? I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the name Numbers. Yeah, it's all about the census. And in particular, what is it that they are counting? Males. More specifically.
Males who can fight.
Males who can fight, more specifically. Males who can fight who are over the age of 20 who are Jewish. Right, okay, good. So now we got all of the different caveats now. And in particular, they're looking at this because, what's the importance of counting at this point in our story? No, not taxes, although that's a good idea.
Probably defense, I would think.
Why?
Well, they're traveling into...
That's right, they're traveling. They're going on a journey, and so they're going to try to figure out who is available to be able to fight, and who can defend them. And so if you just look at the opening chapter of the book of Numbers for a second, page 770. The whole first chapter is devoted to counting the leaders of the people from the tribes. But chapter 2 is actually devoted to the counting of the Levites. And so you actually have two sets of counting back to back. And you can make the argument that the reason why we need to count the Levites is because it's a peace source. It's a priestly source. We want to know exactly how many Levites there are that are going to go from place to place, who are going to essentially function as the leaders of the community. So that's the opening. And then what I want to actually look at with you for just a moment is chapter 3. So turn to page 777. This is the first census of the Levites. By the way that the camp is structured is that you have kind of the Mishkan in the middle, the tabernacle, we'll call that the T, and then you have the tribes set up around them in 12. And each tribe has its own symbol and its own flag and its own mascot, if you will, and they all retain their tribal identities despite the fact that they're all moving together. But there's one group in particular that does not have a tribal location. Who is it? The Levites. So in here are the Levites. So if the Levites are here, how do we get 12? That's right, the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, who will get property. So I want to just look at the opening of chapter 3 for a second, because it's going to put in context a little bit of what we've looked at in the book of Leviticus. Karen, do you have a chumash? We do. Okay, so we're on page 777. Bob, since this is is this your last class?
Yes.
All right, since this is your last class, we'll let you read your swan song.
I wouldn't want to put it that way.
I know.
This is the line of Aaron and Moses at the time that the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These are the names of Aaron's sons: Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Those are the names of Aaron's sons, the anointed priests who were ordained for priesthood. But Nadab and Abihu died by will of the Lord, when they offered alien fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they left no sons. So it was Eleazar and Ithamar who served as priests in the lifetime of their father Aaron.
Okay, so how does the census of the Levites begin?
With two fewer than there would otherwise be.
That is true. There are two fewer than we otherwise would have had.
Counting the Kohanim rather than...
Yeah, we're counting the Kohanim.
Right.
So if you remember from the last class, we talked about the two main tribal lines of priests. One from Aaron and one from Moses. So this has the Aaronic or Aharonic line, and this one has the Mushite line. Does that sound familiar from last time?
Yeah.
For those of you who were here? Okay, so we have these two different tribal lines, and in particular, when it comes to the priests, who is always going to win out? Aaron. Why is Aaron going to win out?
Because it's a P author.
It's a P author, but more specifically, why is it that Moses doesn't win out?
Because that's not,
That's true.
they're not Kohanim.
Well, that's true. They're not Kohanim. But who wrote the P tradition?
An Aaronite priest.
An Aaronite priest. Most likely. And what temple is it coming in? Like,
Second temple.
yeah, it's coming after the tail end of the destruction of the first and the rise of the second temple. Who is all that's left? Anyone that's living in Jerusalem at that particular time. The Aaronic tradition lives on, and so most likely the P tradition that's being redacted is one that comes through the line of Aaron, which is why if you go back and you look at the story earlier in the Exodus, there are moments, bless you, when God is speaking to Moses and he's speaking to Aaron. Right? So Aaron is included in the narrative all the way back through the thread. So in looking at the census of the Levites, we're going to tell you who all of them are through the lens of Aaron. So who wrote this text? P. That makes sense. And we're also going to start by saying who is not there, namely Nadab and Abihu. We're going to take count of them even though they died in the wilderness. Why?
Because they were sons of Aaron.
They were sons of Aaron. All four of the sons of Aaron have a priestly function. In this case, Aaron is turning it over to the next two sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. But let's go on a little bit further. Verse 5.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Advance the tribe of Levi and place them in attendance upon Aaron the priest to serve him. They shall perform duties for him and for the whole community before the tent of meeting, doing the work of the tabernacle. They shall take charge of all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, a duty on behalf of the Israelites, doing the work of the tabernacle. You shall assign the Levites to Aaron and to his sons. They are formally assigned to him from among the Israelites. You shall make Aaron and his sons responsible for observing their priestly duties, and any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death.
All right. What did we just learn?
God has spoken.
That is true. What did God say? What did God say?
Levites are subsidiary to
That's
Aaron.
right. This is where we get the idea that there is a hierarchy. You might have thought that these are both groups of priests, which they may actually be. But in truth, where do we end up? Aaron is the only one that can be the high priest, and any other Levites are subservient to the Aaronic priests.
Right.
We've just created a caste system, if you will, in Jewish tradition, which is why on Shabbat morning, who gets called up first traditionally? Who gets called up second? Who gets called up third?
Everybody
And
else.
everybody else. So part of what the census is actually doing is it's establishing the hierarchy within the priestly tradition. You could have said that we have multiple priestly traditions. We knew that there were priests, there were Midianite priests, there were Aharonic priests, there were Mushite priests. What the census is actually doing more than just counting, which is what we see on the surface, is it's actually establishing who is in the pecking order and where they fall. It's a really important way of understanding what's going to happen through the wandering of the wilderness. If, for a moment, we want to say that the wandering of the wilderness story did not actually happen, because it's during the time post the Exodus, what does this story represent if it was written by a P tradition?
They like to put people to death.
They like to we're going to get to that, because we're going to talk about the blasphemer and the wood gatherer, and those are going to be two instances of putting people to death. So we are going to talk about that in a little bit. Jerry?
I think it establishes that the biblical precedent for Aaron being the priestly line.
That's right. If P was written around the time of the destruction of the first temple, in the generations before and in the generations that follow, by writing this into a narrative that would appear to have been written earlier, at least that's the way we interpret it, it's giving authority to the Aharonic priests as early as the time that we left Egypt. And it's actually saying not only did they have the authority, but we had a priestly-like structure centered around a Mishkan that guided us on our journey wherever we went. In Jewish legal thinking, so in Jewish halakha, we have two different ways of interpreting law. One is called deoraita, and one is called derabbanan. What does it mean, deoraita?
It says so in the Bible.
It says so in the Bible. Deoraita is the Aramaic way of saying from the Torah. Derabbanan, from the rabbis. So when I say the rabbis, what do I mean? I mean the Mishnah and the Gemara. As opposed to Deoraita, which means the 5 books of Moses. By elevating the status, the authority of the priestly narrative to Deoraita, to Torah level, we're giving it the highest regard in terms of practice, in terms of the way that we interpret it. And so right here, as soon as we have begun our wanderings, presumably everything that has happened up until this point has all taken place within the first 2 years from leaving Egypt. Right? We actually haven't even been sentenced to our 40-year wandering period yet. It doesn't happen until a couple of chapters later, chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Numbers. So up until now, the Israelites are not destined to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. So this is just within 2 years of leaving Egypt, and immediately thereafter, we want to establish the priest's hierarchy, their authority. Why else do we want to establish the priest's authority at this point in our story? What has already happened that might call everyone else's authority into question?
The divisions of the kingdom.
So hold on, we'll go to the politics in just a second. In the Torah, what's happened? The golden calf, right? Who participated in the golden calf? Aaron, but who also did not participate in the golden calf? The Levites. Right? The Levites were said to be the ones that did not participate, that Moses said, anyone who didn't participate, come on over to this side of the line, and it was all the Levites.
But then they strapped a sword to their thigh, and then they ran through the crowd and killed 3,000.
That's correct.
Right.
That's right. Which, to get rid of all the people that were not like them.
Right.
Okay? Now, you brought up a really interesting point, which is what's going on politically that we need to kind of highlight here. So what's the political background?
Well, I think this is written after the division of the northern and southern kingdom.
That's right. So this is a text that's written after the northern kingdom has separated from the southern kingdom and after the northern kingdom has fallen in 722. So why is that important?
Well, I learned from the class that
I wouldn't trust a word that you learned.
well, my understanding is that the Mushite priests predominated in the northern kingdom.
Good. All right. Did everyone follow what he just said?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's try it again. This is a text that was written by which author? P. Okay. It was written by a priestly tradition. Yeah.
P is problematic now.
Okay.
So all the Levites are priests, right? But they're not
yes.
anointed to go into the tent of meeting. So now what we're seeing is a subdivision of the priests into the Kohanim. So is it more accurate if we use Levitical and Kohanim?
Well, that's what we've been trying to grapple with here. So remember what we talked about. Are all priests Levites or are all Levites priests?
Priests are Levites.
All priests are Levites.
All Levites are not priests.
No. Now, what we did learn, though, is that we had multiple strands of priestly division that came from Moses and from Aaron. Because they're brothers. Although we also looked at maybe they're not brothers, or maybe they're stepbrothers, or half-brothers, or they call each other bro, I don't know. But, But they both had priests that came with them. And by the way, Moses marries a priestess. He marries Zipporah was the daughter of a priest. So there's lots of different priests that are floating around back in that particular time, and each one has their own group of people that come from them. But the Torah has told us that Aaron's line is going to be the one with the high priests. Everybody else, including in this week's Torah portion, which is all about Korach, they're all the Levitical cousins. But what's Korach's claim in his rebellion? What does he want?
That he should be, or he and his people, are just as legitimate as priests.
Correct. And what's actually not clear about his claim is he making the argument about only his siblings, his cousins, other Levites? Or is he saying the whole Israelite people is holy? So why are you setting yourselves apart? It's actually not clear from the text. On one level, it would seem to suggest he's trying to make the claim that all of Israel is holy. And on another level, because of who is involved in the fighting, who's involved in the fighting, in the rebellion?
Datan and
Abiram
and On,
and On, Ben Pelet, who are all descendants of
Reuben,
Reuben. Why do we need to know that?
his firstborn.
Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob. So you're having a fight, if you will, between all of the possible leaders who could have been, or felt like they had some entitlement to leading the people. And so it's actually not clear that what we're talking about here is just something Levites. What will happen is that you will find a group that is let in to the inner sanctum, what we'll call the tent of meeting and things like that in just a little bit. Not today, but in a couple weeks. Or on the outside is one of the tribes. Julie.
So I am confused.
Me too.
Who is considered a Kohen then? I mean, is it Aaron and his? Okay, so those are,
Yeah.
but they're Levite. They were, so the Levites were. I mean, some of the Levites were Kohanim. Is that?
So we'll take a step back for a second. Jacob has how many sons?
12.
12 sons and one daughter, Dina. You don't want to forget about Dina. All right, and what's the pecking order of the sons? Who are the first four? Reuben, Simeon, Levi,
Judah.
and Judah. We know that Levi has 3 sons as well. And one of those sons is going to give birth to Amram. Amram will be the father of Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. We also know that the other siblings, right, Moses' grandfathers, also have children. And so Moses' first cousin, Moses and Aaron's first cousin, is going to be Korach. So what we've learned, though, is that they're all part of the Levite tribe. Meaning they're all descendants of Jacob's son Levi, or Levi. But what we also learn is that one of the branches, if you will, that come off of that, specifically Aaron's branch, was given different separate status.
Were they called Kohanim at that time?
Not initially.
No.
They become Kohanim in the book of Leviticus.
Okay.
They are separated at that point.
Okay.
And Aaron becomes what we'll call Kohen Gadol, right? The high priest, the biggest priest, the grand poobah, if you will, of the priests. And anyone who then descends from him will be a priest as well. But that means that Moses is not a priest. Moses' sons are not priests. We actually, other than the mentioning of their being born, we don't have any reference to Moses' sons thereafter. And everybody else, Korach and his descendants, also not priests. Why is it ironic that Aaron's line is the chosen line?
Aaron's not such a good guy.
Aaron's not such a good guy. He does help with the Exodus. He does help being the mouthpiece. But what does he also do? How does he engage with the golden calf?
He does it, and he blames it on the people.
That's right. So the people are, Moses is up on the mountain. The people are freaking out. Where's God? What do we do? And he says, give me your jewelry. I'm going to throw it in the pit, and poof, out comes the golden calf. Because we all know that that's exactly how it happened. And then they all dance around, and he's kind of saying, I'll delay. Tomorrow will be a chag for Adonai, for Yud Hey Vav Hey. And hopefully by then Moses will be back and we'll get this whole thing sorted out. Moses comes down, he destroys the calf, he destroys the tablets, everything goes to whatever. And what we're left with is essentially a separation where Moses says anyone who wasn't involved, who was that? The Levites, we don't have priests yet, are going to go to the side. Aaron's going to be spared. And then in the book of Leviticus, Aaron's status is elevated. Why?
It's a priestly author.
Okay, so before we go to that, why?
Because he's from Jerusalem.
That goes to that argument as well. Why is he actually elevated? Why do you think, according to the Torah, Aaron is given the title of priest, of high priest?
Because,
Maybe.
because his descendants were succeeded in the struggle between Moses and Moses.
Again, that's a political argument. I think that's also true.
And it could have anything to do with his work during the Exodus from Egypt.
Could be. I also, yeah,
I think because he has no political. He's just a conduit.
could be. And that, by the way, that's exactly what his role was during the Exodus. He was the intermediary between God, Moses, and the people.
Spokesman.
He's a mouthpiece.
You could also make the argument that the reason why Aaron is given this role is that it's the ultimate form of atonement for the golden calf. Remember, one of the first things that he does when he becomes a priest is he offers a sacrifice of
Sin offering.
a sin offering of a calf.
Yes.
Right? It's midah keneged midah. It's measure for
So we
measure.
were looking at it as a.
Now, let's look at it.
And a reward. And
Correct.
He's got all the power, but he also has the burden.
That's correct. He has the power and the burden. So now let's look at it from a political perspective. Why are Aaron's descendants given the responsibility of being the priests? Go ahead.
There's an irony that I think it's fair to point out. And that's that for the most part, I can't say that this is always the case, but for the most part when you say, Vayedaber Adonai, it's Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe, or it's Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe v'Aharon.
That's correct.
That it's very rare, or it doesn't occur at all, where it says Vayedaber Adonai el Aharon.
You got it. That's right. And by the way, you can make the argument that Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon is a priestly emendation. It's a way of the priests rewriting Aaron's authority back into the text. An edit. An edit. Right? They amend the text.
Can I put that in a different way?
Sure.
I mean, Aaron never once issues any instruction in the Torah.
I don't know if that's true. I feel like there are some times where Aaron speaks,
But he doesn't tell anybody what to do.
and if he does, I don't know that they listen, but no, he does. The golden calf, he does, sure.
Well, that's hardly something to be proud of.
He wasn't leading it, he just was
Right.
a conduit.
Okay, so let's go back to the political thing. Why is the Aharonic line through Aaron the dominant priestly narrative from a political perspective? Yeah?
Because they survived the first conquest by the Assyrians,
Mhm.
and they're in power now
That's right.
in the southern.
And that's where Phil, your answer comes in. Right? They were the priests that were living in the southern kingdom in Jerusalem, and the Mushite priests, the people who descended from Moses, were living in the northern kingdom. What did the northern priests want for their worship system? What did they do with their worship system? They decentralized it, which meant what?
Don't need priests.
They don't need the centralized temple in Jerusalem, so they set up altars all over the northern kingdom. And one of the first things that happens after the Assyrians come in is they destroy all of them. All of the, like Hezekiah and Josiah, they destroy all of the, idols and the altars that existed in the north. Who remains? The priests of the south, the priests of Jerusalem, the priests of the temple. Who were they? Aharonic.
And they get to write the story.
They get to write the story.
I think the Samaritans...
Julie, did that help?
Yes, yeah.
Okay? One of the things that we see about authorship is that so much of it has to do with a little bit of survival of the fittest, if you will, and ultimately which story you get to tell based on who's left. You can rewrite the narrative however you want. So why do they keep Moses in the story?
Because they knew it. Everybody, it was known.
That's right. To take it out would have done what to the authority of the Aharonic priests? That's exactly right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right. It undermines their credibility.
So manipulated.
By the way, and even in a traditional read, you can't get rid of Moses because there wasn't anybody like Moses. But if you think about what happens after the Torah is done, after the 5 books of Moses, Moses is more or less gone. Right? Every now and then there's a reference to it, but in general, outside of the 5 books of Moses, we don't really see that story told.
Because the Aaronite priests made sure to say that he never even made it into the land. Did he make it? Did he not make it?
Right.
But who kept him out? I think that's.
But Aaron didn't make it in either.
Could-
Did he die?
Aaron doesn't make it into the land either, But what does Aaron get to continue in perpetuity? That's right. His line lives on in perpetuity, right? This line, the Aaronic priestly line, lives on forever. Moses just becomes a Levite. And so the Levites stay in the text, and we have it in the book of Numbers. We just read it. They're there, but they are subservient to the priests.
So the Moses line becomes the priests in the north.
Yeah.
So, and the Aaronic line in the south. So then they both sort of entered at the same level
Until
the
there's a
north
split.
was. Yeah.
Until there's a split in the kingdom. And any time that you have a split in a kingdom, what ends up happening as a result of the split?
One emerges.
Each one gets its own set of leaders. It's kind of like I have the shul that I go to and the shul that I don't go to, right? I could go to the temple in Jerusalem, but why go to that temple if I can make my own temple here?
It's like Northern California, Southern California, and California.
Right, although I thought we were just trying to vote to make make into 5 to 3
That's
states.
the other
Yeah, how'd that go?
countries. All the other countries.
Oh, qualified? Oh.
Yeah, that's
Can I
what
jump in?
Julie said. We
Right.
agree.
Right. We'll just go around.
You were listening to NPR radio, right?
No.
And that's what.
What was the vote?
It's going to be on the ballot.
No, I know, but what did they need to?
To split the state into
Oh, that's all they needed?
They got more
three
than-
crazy Republican states and one hyper-liberal Democratic state.
Cool.
So I'm thinking the story of Pincus.
Yes.
I'm
We're gonna
wondering
get there.
if that- Okay, so I'll just.
But no, go ahead, ask your question.
So in that story, if I remember correctly, Pincus is also given the blessing that all his descendants will be priests.
Yes.
And I can't remember, but I assume he's an Aaronite, and
Yeah.
I wonder if that's a second reason for establishing the Aaronite priests as having this eternal covenant of priesthood,
That what's the second reason for that?
because of his action.
Oh, yeah. So we're going to look at the Pinchas story because the Pinchas story is a great example of the tension between the zealous nature of a priest and people who would assimilate. Right? So Pinchas is a priest, and he kills people who are engaged in either inappropriate sexual or idolatrous behavior. And he's rewarded on this very grand level, and it's almost as if to say that the reason he's rewarded is because of his piety, his zealousness, his zealous nature for God. Which, if he's an Aaronic priest, that says a lot about who he is, what he does, and why they respond so positively to him. Yeah, Phil, and then...
So 2 things. I think this happened long before the destruction of the temple.
what happened?
I think this division actually began with the building of the first temple by Solomon, because in order to build the temple, there were very heavy levies or taxes on the north.
Yeah.
And that created a schism because the north didn't want to be giving all this labor and money, and it began a political separation between the two.
Correct.
And then the other thing is you can
even make the argument that it happens before the building of the temple when David moves the capital.
Exactly. And then the second part is the Samaritans. You know, we never talk about the Samaritans enough as Jews, but the Samaritans were several million people in the northern kingdom, of which there are only like 780 left today. And you can see it in the Torah because they talk about Mount Geron and Mount
Ebal.
Ebal, right? And you know that whole which mountain gets it kind of confusing.
It's a Deuteronomic part.
Yeah.
So we haven't looked at it yet.
So you know these divisions between the north and south, Mushite or not, is really all got to do with Jerusalem and centralized practices.
That's right. Well, what was the reason why David moved the capital?
Or what did he say? I don't know.
Shortens to mountain.
Shorten his commute, right. He was getting stuck on 92 and 101 every day. Why did he move the capital?
Because it's a military base.
Yeah, it was a military stronghold, that's for sure. Absolutely.
And it had its own water supply.
Yep.
I think it was sitting in the shadow of Egypt, and the Assyrian Empire was much more powerful, and Egypt dominated that area, and
Right.
it was this like little buffer space where you can stay safe.
But it was a political
He didn't
decision.
want to be the West Bank. Hebron.
I don't want to answer that question because there are those people who think that Jerusalem is in the West
Okay.
Bank, or part of it is.
Isn't Jerusalem in the West Bank?
Yeah.
Depends how you draw the borders.
Oh.
Sorry.
No, but it was a political decision. It was absolutely political, and it also was a centrality decision in moving it. But as a result, it becomes not just the political center, but the spiritual center. And what this is the authorship of a spiritual, not just political work. Right? There's a spiritual goal in writing this text because ultimately, what are we talking about here? We're talking about God's authority. So there's lots of different pieces that we're playing out. But I wanted to highlight this text to you because this is the text that says we're going to acknowledge that there are different kinds of people, many of whom come from Levi, but we're going to separate one group from the other. Yeah.
Yesterday, I listened to a Christian woman talk to me about Jesus and other things. And the day before, I was at a Muslim's iftar. The reason I'm saying that is because by removing Moses from the connection between the people and God, it's like in the psyche that is a missing connection that for Christianity was that whole, that connection was replaced by Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Muslims, that's replaced by Muhammad.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
it's like, what are we going to do without him? Well, we're going to create this other religion, another religion that has that human need.
By the
And
way,
we take away the idols, right? And all we have is our imagination.
yeah, but so I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, Ziva, which is this idea that we always needed a prophetic figure to function in that capacity. After Moses, it's these other prophets. But what actually happens, right? So the first temple is destroyed in 587, 86. It's then rebuilt and completed in 515. These are BCE. When's the second temple destroyed?
70.
And when's the Mishnah written?
200 something.
Okay, so what ends up happening is that sometime, we'll say that around 965 is when the first temple was built, roughly, maybe 960. Basically, if we're saying that this is the kind of end, more or less, of the Pentateuchal period, so about 1000 is the end of the 5 books of Moses. From around 1000 until 200 of the Common Era, Moses is not the preeminent figure. There might be a reference here or there. There's a lot of emphasis on the kings, on the judges, on the prophets, and on the priests. But what the rabbis do is they reintroduce Moses into rabbinic literature
Oh,
as that spiritual figure.
right.
And why is it happening around this time?
The Passover Seder, for example.
Well, that's true,
that cues
right? But
that.
that's exactly right. So the Passover Seder, we need a figure who becomes the dominant, voice behind that Exodus story. But what has just happened within the last 100 years, and what's happening around this time?
The Bar Kokhba.
Right. So you're having other revolts that are happening right now, and you're also having the rise of Christianity.
But the text was solidified around Josiah around 600 BCE.
You're talking about Deuteronomy. You're talking about you're talking about the 5 books of Moses canon.
Yes.
What I'm suggesting is that so we have Moses as a central
In the 5
figure
books.
in the 5 books up until about the destruction of the first temple.
Right.
But then from then on, it's priestly focused. The rabbis are the ones who reintroduce Moses as a preeminent figure, right? Really kind of on an elevated level, learning from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, and he becomes a central figure in the rabbinic works of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Right? When you no longer have a temple, when you no longer have priests, when you no longer have prophets, we go back to the one who was the original prophet. By the way, that's happening around the same time that Christianity is about to form, and they also find a prophet. A few centuries later, when the Talmud is being completed, that's when Islam comes. They need a prophet. So in some ways, the priests filled the gap, and then Moses comes back to the scene. Stan, you look like you wanted to say something, or you're still thinking.
Yeah, I'm been a little confused by Friedman in that I think he talks about, I think it's Josiah, which he claims is a Levitical,
Mhm.
supports the Levitical priests.
Yes.
As opposed to Hezekiah or the peace source. So, and a lot of what
Well, you could
Josiah
also make
did,
the argument that. Oh wait, sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
and the prophet Jeremiah.
Mhm.
And so if that's true, then that idea of the Mushites really made it all the way to Josiah's time, which is 600.
Right. Yeah. Well, what we were saying before was that the Mushite line really stays a relevant story through the destruction of the Northern Kingdom,
Right.
which is 722 BCE, probably a few generations thereafter, until we get Deuteronomy in the book of Josiah, which is in the mid-600s, right? So 7th century. So yeah, it really does make it all the way through the fall of the Northern Kingdom and maybe even a little bit further.
But I'm glad you mentioned Hezekiah, because the problem that happened with Moses is the same problem that's have arisen in some respect with regards to Jesus, in that there was a cult of Moses. And the staff that he had become a cult symbol, and a temple was built around it, and it was Hezekiah that destroys
it, right?
So the shift.
But when does he destroy it?
100 years before Josiah or something.
Right.
So when is Hezekiah living?
In the First Reformation.
Yes, during the time of the Assyrian revolt. So
Right.
he's living toward the transition between the 8th century and the 7th century BCE.
Right.
The Northern Kingdom falls in 722, and the famous campaign against Hezekiah on the south, when he builds the tunnels and everything, is in 701. Okay, so he's living during the reign when the north has just been conquered, where the Assyrians are after those people who are living in Jerusalem. Once they survive, what does Hezekiah do? He goes and he cleans shop up north. And he gets rid of all of the idols that were left from before.
And hence the reason for the destruction of the first temple is?
Idolatry. But according to whom? So either through Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Josiah, right? Or through the rabbis who reinterpreted that.
It had to be by Josiah, because it's in the 5 books. It's a
Josiah
dominant
and Jeremiah.
theme. Yeah, it's a dominant theme in the 5 books.
Absolutely. One of the major themes that we see over and over and over again in Deuteronomy, like ad nauseum, is don't worship idols. So much so that it takes the central focus of the middle paragraph of the Shema. Right? If you do what's good and what's right, you'll be rewarded with rain in your seasons. But if you let yourself get astray and you worship idols, you won't get rain in your seasons.
So getting back to...
By the way, that's the part we all read silently, so if you aren't familiar with it. In the Reform movement, they actually take it out of the liturgy. Because
Yes, because it doesn't make sense, really.
you're right, it doesn't make sense. I want to use that actually as a theology. No, it doesn't make sense. I like it.
So can Korach then be considered a bookend for what we just read? Because this starts what we just read is a justification for the Aaronite priesthood, and Korach is the test of that, and it settles it for all time.
Yes.
That it's going to be Aaron.
Yeah. Well, and there's probably a couple of pieces that are bookends. One is the Korach story. One is the death of Aaron. One is the fact that Moses isn't going to make it into the land. Right. The whole story of the hitting of the rock. By the way, it's not because he hit the rock that Moses doesn't go in. It's because he ascribes the power to get water to himself rather than to God. Right? So all of those things fit with the idea that we're ending the Mushite line and we're supporting the Aharonic line from a political perspective. Yeah.
Does every major religion have a central prophet?
Most of them. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's an important part of religion.
Yeah.
Buddha.
Yeah. that's
Yeah.
right.
Well, why do we have prophets and margins? Why do we have prophets?
To tell us what we're doing wrong, what we should be doing right.
Right? For those of you who remember, there was a class that we had a couple years ago all about prophets. What are the different kinds of prophets?
Those who are assigned by God, essentially commissioned.
Yep, you see, there are the commissioned prophets. Yeah. There's also the ecstatic prophets. Those are the magician ones like Elijah and Elisha. And then we also have prophets who do what?
Make predictions. They're seers.
They are seers, yeah. That's true. That's what a Navi is. You do have false prophets. And they actually warn about that in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus against false prophecy. But they're also the moral compass. Right? So Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Jeremiah, they are moral exemplars, if you will. They may be a little, off the deep end in some respects, but they're the ones who are getting up there saying, God doesn't want your sacrifices, God wants you to change your behavior.
And they've all spoken to God, right?
Presumably. Or at least they convince you that they
They're
have.
the ones, they were Mushite descendants.
Some of them were Mushite descendants. Depends on the name. Depends also on the name.
Hosea, I think was.
Was Jesus a prophet?
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
Okay. Did we read this?
Just as he came after the canonization.
Jesus does not become prophet-like, or does not become revered as a savior until several generations after he lives. And it's not by him, it's by people who follow him or want to tell his story. Yeah.
But the northern kingdom was Elohistic.
For the most part, yes.
And the southern was Yahwistic.
Yes.
And, the Elohists are pagans. And the Yahwists are aniconic. There's no image of God. You don't even have a name for God. So it's a different theological framework, I think, between the two. It's not just politics.
Right.
I think there's a deep theological separation between the two.
Okay. So I just want to... Stan?
Well, you have to argue that there's enough similarity that they could be combined by the redactor into a JE.
And then bad always co-opts good. And then, you have people that turn Moses' staff into an idol. Or, Buddha, who was definitely a man, becomes a god.
Yeah.
Or, Jesus was not a god was not a deity until Constantine in the 300s. He was just a prophet. So, we what did they say is the things that you consider holy are the things that become your gods. And you have to be careful what you call holy.
Right?
Holy smoke, right?
So, what did you say? Holy smoke? Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's-
I just want to talk...
Wasn't that what the Hebrews were following around in the Exodus period?
Holy smoke? Oh,
Wow.
is that what it was?
Pillar of
Well,
fire.
wasn't
It was a pillar of fire and a smoke and a cloud.
Yeah.
Oh. I'm going to start calling it holy smoke. So I just want to highlight for you three things about the priests. The priests had many roles. Among the primary was the officiation of sacrifices in the temple. But they also had ritual roles as well that were in addition to that. One was the presiding over the ceremony about the sota. So the sota was what?
The
The sota.
David,
The State of the Union, yes.
It's about the jealous husband
That's
who
right.
believes his wife has been adulterous.
S-O-T-A-H.
right,
Okay, the sota was the suspected adulteress. Basically, it went like this. There was
Oh,
a jealous husband
He drinks
who
it.
accuses his wife of
Yeah.
being an adulteress, and her behavior is therefore called into question, and they put her on trial, almost like a witch hunt, where she is forced to drink this concoction of dirt and water, and if her body sags, then she is found guilty. It could have been also a way of suggesting that maybe she miscarried and she was pregnant. And if that was the case, then she was guilty and she would have been killed. But if that didn't happen, then it essentially allows her to go free, and it puts the husband back at ease. It was the responsibility of the Kohen, of the priest, to officiate over this very bizarre and challenging ritual. So that's chapter 5 of the book of Numbers. And immediately thereafter, in chapter 6, is the law of the Nazarite. The Nazir. What was a Nazir?
One who takes a pledge to be super holy.
Yeah. pledged to be super holy, which means what?
For a fixed duration of time.
Usually for a fixed duration of time. And what do you refrain from?
Wine,
Cutting your hair,
Alcohol.
Wine.
any wine derivative,
or any wine derivative. Okay? And why?
so that you're not,
So that you're not drunk. It's a good question. Why? So why?
so that you don't become like
Nadav and Abihu. So maybe there was a fear that you might do what Nadav and Abihu did, which was they drank hypothetically and then offered strange fire. And we got that from what came immediately after their death. Why else?
Because you're not a Jew, but you have to operate in Jewish territory, and there have to be rules for how you can do that.
No, a Nazir was a Jew. Or was an Israelite, in this case.
Aren't they already bound by the Nazarite? Or are we a superset of the Nazarite rules? Not really. Okay.
No. A Nazirite was a man or a woman of Israelite faith who chooses to take this on. Why?
atonement.
Could be for atonement, but it could also be because they wanted to function or be like priests. It was the Israelite, when I say Israelite, I mean priest, Levite, Israelite. It was the Israelite way of making oneself separate and apart to have function or capacity or holiness in the same way that a priest or Levite did. So all of these stories are actually kind of one after the other. We have the role of the priests, the Levites being subservient to them, this idea of them officiating over the ritual of the Sota, and Israelites, if they want to be priest-esque or priest-like, they can become a Nazir. At the very end of these stories, I want to show you one additional function of the priest. Turn to page 804. The priests have one other function. You should all know this one. Bob, will you read starting in verse 22 to 26 on 804?
The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons. Thus shall you bless the people of Israel. Say to them, the Lord bless you and protect you. The Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. The Lord bestow his favor upon you and grant you peace."
Everyone know what that one is? The priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly benediction. When do we do this today? So we do it on the high holidays. You can actually do it on all of the festivals as well. In Israel, they do it every day. They invite the Kohanim up to do it. So one of the other functions of the priest was that they participated in a ritual whereby they bestow God's blessing on the people. Yeah.
I want to point out that, and I hope this is correct, that the answer to the question of who is entitled to bless somebody is an important question.
Yep.
So the answer is you are, first of all, entitled to bless yourself, which I think is magnificent. And then anybody is entitled to bless anybody else. I think it's just a necessary concept on the path to peace.
Yes, I agree.
But this one is a different blessing. This is a blessing of holiness.
Yes.
So only the Aaronic line could consecrate people and create holiness. That's their job.
It's even more than holiness, because on some level, you're right, this is a blessing of God to the people, but we always skip verse 27. Because this is not the part that we say. We only recite verses 24, 25, and 26. Verse 27 says, "V'samu et shmi al b'nei Yisrael, va'ani avarachem," which means that they will place my name on Israel, on the children of Israel, va'ani avarachem. Who's actually doing the blessing? God is doing the blessing. The priests are functioning as go-betweens between God and the people. Anyone who ever thought that the priest was actually blessing the people is actually incorrect. It is the priests functioning on behalf of God to offer and bestow this blessing. They are the intermediaries, the intercessors. That's what they're doing when they're offering sacrifices, but it's also what they're doing when they bestow blessing. And so I think it's an important distinction to see that in some ways they link this role, and you'll notice, by the way, not only is this a P tradition, but what name of God does it use? Adonai. We're using the J version of God's name, kind of the one name of God, the same name that's in the Shema, the same name that we say is Yahweh, the same name that we talk about was the God of the priests in the southern kingdom, as opposed to the Elohists in the north. That is the God, the one God, the aniconic God, no image God. That is the God that is blessing the people, and it is the priests who function as the ones transmitting that blessing to the people.
I'm again, this just elaborates to an unnecessary degree the point I made before. Vayadaber Adonai al Moshe lemor.
Yep.
Daber
Daber el
Aharon.
That's right.
What is that? I mean, if they're redacting, if they're trying to place themselves in the front of the line, why do they include sentence 20? Sentence 22.
So that's a great question. So this, you can make the argument, is the tension that that the redactor is wrestling with about what do you do to give authority to the Aharonic line, knowing that Moses has such, tremendous respect and power and authority, and has been revered as our leader and our, one who took us out of Egypt. What do you do with the Moses piece, and at the same time elevate the Aharonic piece? What do? They leave Moses in, but it's Moses giving the power to Aaron, rather than taking it for himself.
Moses is the conduit, and ultimately, that's where you get authority from.
Yeah.
So, the high priest also has the function of going into the Holy of Holies once a year.
Correct.
And offer atonement for us. That's also a ritual.
Yeah, we looked at that one back in Leviticus.
And we also have the high priest who accepts the sacrifices of the firstborn.
Yeah, actually, we didn't read that. I was going to show. That's the second part of the after the subservience of the Levites. It talks about all of the firstborns being dedicated to the priests.
Right.
Right. So the idea of the redemption of the firstborn. That piece.
The thing we have to remember, though, right, is that the priestly class serves the people.
Yeah.
So
What is the name of the high priest? Do we have
Aaron.
names for the high priest? We talk about high priests
Yes.
without the names.
the
Aaron.
gadol, the
Kohen Gadol.
Kohen gadol.
Yeah. Okay.
Where did that word Kohen come from?
Yeah, I was.
I mean, Kohen, it's not like...
Sounds like king.
I think Cohen came later. Kohen. I mean, I don't know what the etymological
What's the
derivation.
flourish, in other words?
Kaf Hey Nun.
And does that...
Does it mean something? I mean, it wasn't a tribe.
It means priest. I'd have to look up and see what the etymology is. I could look it up though.
Is there a line in Leviticus that says now Aaron's line is going to be called Kohen? Is there something that says that actually?
When he becomes, kind of put in that role
It
as
says
priest.
you are the Kohen.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the
Kohen
weirdest.
gadol.
That's one of the weirdest sections of the whole Torah. They go on and talk about God becomes like a clothier, the sash and the gown and the breastplate and this. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The commissioning of Aaron is very extensive. You always got to ask yourself, why?
Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do for next week is I would like you to read in Friedman, starting with chapter 9 in the Sources Revealed book.
Which is, they're both Friedman.
No, this one, the one that has the Torah in it. But I want you to look at it in Friedman because I want you to see the authorship. So page 255 to page 270. At the very least through 268. There are a series of stories once the wandering starts happening which includes the story of the manna, the story of the hitting of the rock, the story of the spies, and the story of Korach's rebellion. There are these stories that happen kind of one after the other that are actually not all P. They're a combination of J and E and P, and they have different functions. So I want to look at those stories with you because they're very important and integral to the understanding of the formation of Numbers, of the book of Numbers. They're also narrative in nature, as opposed to Leviticus, which was legal in nature, or sacrificial in nature. These are actual stories. These are stories that, in theory, you could tell to your kids, as like a, Lord of the Rings kind of thing. Okay, so I want to look at those stories with you because all of a sudden we've gone from a very clear P tradition to a reintegration of these other authors in the stories of our wandering through the wilderness. And ultimately, as a result of these stories, it's going to set in motion what we need to understand to get to Deuteronomy, which is that Deuteronomy is actually not about the generation that left Egypt, but it's about the generation that is either about to enter Israel or has already been living in Israel. Okay? Any questions? Thoughts? Jerry, you doing okay?